All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined once again by Dr. Always great to say that now. Still relatively new title, Christopher Tomaszewski. And we're going to be talking about modal collapse yet again. Chris has been on the show before to discuss this issue, but it's an evolving conversation. And Chris, welcome back to the show. And it's good to have you here and looking forward to this.
Thank you, Pat. Happy to be back.
So there is something of an announcement that you told me previously, like 5 minutes ago, and I thought it might be cool maybe if we start off with that. What do you say?
Yeah, sure.
If it's okay to announce.
Yeah, no, it's okay to announce. And that announcement is that I'm going to be writing a book for the Cambridge Element series over the next year or so, hopefully appearing sometime in early to mid 2024 on divine simplicity, simplicator, not just on the modal collapse issue, although that will be that will feature in a large way in the book, but also covering the history and motivation of the doctrine, its compatibility with the Trinity, its compatibility with the Incarnation, and concluding hopefully in a big way with my take on the role it plays in ultimate explanation.
Yeah. Do you mind if we start with that a little bit, Chris, the role of ultimate explanation? Because before we get into the technical weeds of some of the objections of divine simplicity, I think it's always important to show why people have been committed to divine simplicity. And I've told you this before in our previous conversation, you know, I'm still committed to it, that I really think it's divine simplicity or bust when it comes to whether the world is ultimately intelligible or not.
Right.
So yeah, give us your thoughts on that and maybe motivate it a little bit for us before we start responding to some of the objections. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess, right. I mean, I get the impression that a lot of people probably think that I and other Catholics who defend the doctrine of divine simplicity do so because it's a dogma of the Catholic faith, which it is, or because we just really love Thomas Aquinas or something like that, which we do. But that's not, neither of those are my primary reason. And one reason why I say that, you know, it's being a dogma of the faith is not my primary reason is it's probably more precise to say that I'm Catholic because I believe in divine simplicity than to say that I believe in divine simplicity because I'm Catholic. Because of course the doctrine of divine simplicity is a deliverance of natural theology, and given that I'm convinced of that, you know, I look at when I'm making a decision about which church or which theory of revealed theology is correct, I'm looking for one that affirms the correct view of what I think I can ascertain on purely natural theology, right? So like this is why I don't even spend any time reading, for example, Mormon sources on revealed theology, studying the Book of Mormon, really trying to hunker down and figure out if it's a plausible theory of revealed theology, sacred theology, because it just blatantly contradicts things that are very incontrovertible deliverances of natural theological reasoning that really just throws that theory of sacred theology out the window immediately. I mean, right. The doctrine of divine simplicity, it does the same for me. Like I don't know how I could affirm any theory of revealed or sacred theology that denied that doctrine, or even really left it open, given how central it is to model of God. And the reason why, one of the reasons why I think it's so central and so important is because, you know, we want God to do a lot of things, chief among them to save us from our sins. that's like soteriologically and on a personal level what we want God to do. But God is also, playing a theoretical role for us, right? He is a theoretical posit in our metaphysics, and insofar as he's a theoretical posit in our metaphysics, we want him to do certain work. And the classical theist perspective starts from the idea that the number one thing we want God to do in our theories as a theoretical posit is to provide ultimate explanation for the world as we observe it around us. I think that's like the best conception of what natural theology ultimately is, right?
Yeah.
We start off with a philosophy of nature and with a metaphysics built on as close as we can get to a common sense explanation of the world around us. And that leads us inexorably to questions about contingency and being that lead us to a quest for ultimate explanation. And the reason the doctrine of divine simplicity ends up being so important, right, is because without it, I don't think you ultimately get to the destination that Plato and Aristotle and other pre-Christian thinkers, the road that they were on. I don't think you actually get to the destination you're actually trying to get to without the doctrine of divine simplicity, at least some form of it. Maybe it doesn't, strictly speaking, have to be the full-blown Thomistic doctrine, although I suspect that it does. But it has to be some form of that. That's the number one reason I believe in a doctrine of divine simplicity, is because I'm concerned about ultimate explanation and theories of natural theology that don't have a doctrine of divine simplicity, to my mind, simply are not able to provide that kind of ultimate explanation. And right, what I'm ultimately talking about here, ultimate explanation, is the ability to explain everything contingent in terms of something which is has two features. One is that it is in itself necessary per se, not necessary through something else, and also in some sense self-explanatory, right?
Yeah.
In order to terminate this regressive explanation.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I see seems to be going through the minds of some non-classical theists is the thought that if something is necessary, then it doesn't require explanation. I can kind of see the origin of that idea to some degree in the work of Leibniz, insofar as the principle of sufficient reason is supposed to be a principle about contingent beings or contingent truths. But I'm not remotely buying that for a number of reasons. So, like, for example, when classical theists will ask non-classical theists, well, what explains the structure of God if he's not absolutely simple? Why does he have the features that he has? Why does he have the properties that he has? What makes it be the case that those properties and only those properties inhere in the divine substance in the way that you say they do, and so on? And usually, what I've seen, at least from some thinkers on the neoclassical side, is, well, look, that's just the way God necessarily is. And if that's the way that God necessarily is, that's the end of the story about explanation. Because we can't explain necessary things, or we needn't explain necessary things, I guess the thought sometimes goes. And being a mathematician myself,
so we explain necessary truths all the time in mathematics, right?
Right. Yeah. Being a mathematician, I'm not remotely buying the idea that we don't need to explain or cannot explain what is necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I wanted to go in, for example, for the idea that maybe basic arithmetical truths are inexplicable or self-explanatory, perhaps in some sense, such as 1 + 1 = 2, although anybody familiar with Bertrand Russell's work will be aware that he spent quite some time trying to explain even that. Certainly, it's not the case that Fermat's last theorem, for example, even though it is necessarily true, like everything else in mathematics, at least given the axioms, even though it is necessarily true, it's clearly not self-explanatory, nor is it immune to explanation in virtue of its necessity, or rendered, nor is it the case that it doesn't need to be explained because it's necessary.
Yes.
Right. Like it needs to be explained. It can be explained. It has been explained. And yet it's as necessary as any other mathematical truth, as necessary as any other necessary truth, as far as we know, at least necessary truths that are necessary in the way that mathematical truths are necessary. I definitely don't buy the line that necessity is somehow puts a stop to the need for explanation.
Well, that's interesting. If I can, real quick, Chris, that if a non-classical theist is going to say that, I mean, what they're saying actually seems like a very naturalistic thing to say. I mean, it's sort of like what a Graham Oppie would say, right? Take some initial physical state. It's necessary, right? And then, of course, the theist wants to say, well, how or why is it necessary? Or certain moral facts, right? Why are those necessary? And then the naturalist, I won't bring Oppie specifically in here because he's not here to defend himself, but just say a naturalist in general could just insist that they're necessary. They don't need a further explanation. So I would just say a theist should be quite careful about playing that game, because that's a game that could be and already is being played by a bunch of naturalists, just calling something necessary and saying that's the end. We don't need to get any sort of further explanation. Would open them up to, I think, a pretty rigorous battle with naturalism. Plus, I just think it's just false. Like you said, we explain various necessary truths. They can be explained, they have been explained, and they should be explained as well. So, yeah, continue.
Right. Yeah. So, so the way this ties in with the book project is that the last chapter is going to try to explain exactly how the doctrine of divine simplicity serves this role of supporting the project for ultimate explanation, by way of answering the question of why is there something rather than nothing, in terms of an answer which identifies God's essence with his being, and goes a little bit further beyond that. So this is actually an area where I'm actually taking the standard rote Thomist answer to this question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Ed Fazer has had some stuff to say about this, other Thomists. And you frequently, the way this goes is they're like, well, look, that's because God's essence just is to be. And that's why there's something rather than nothing. And I actually don't think that it goes far enough, because I think it's certainly open to ask the question, well, okay, yes, but why did there have to be being, right? So the last chapter is, without giving too much away right now, geared toward trying to answer the question of why there would have to be subsistent being. And if that's the case, then there has to be, then if there is such a being whose essence just is his being, then we can have an ultimate explanation, as far as explanation can go, of why there is a God, and therefore why there is everything that is in God, and also why is there everything that's contingent, everything that's created by God, and sustained by God. Yeah. That's awesome. There's I love to that latter point. I think that's really important, because I think that is something worthy of investigating. You can kind of get at it by asking, does existence exist? Does existence have to exist? I think those are meaningful questions, and good ones to wrestle with.
and I'll be excited to see where you go with it. And I also I think it was Stump, right? She's got an article in Aquinas where she says, look, minimally divine simplicity helps give you a ground for PSR and avoid Euthyphro's dilemma. So there's at least 2 theoretical advantages, like right there.
Right. Yeah.
So it does a lot of theoretical work, and I think it's right. If the way I've thought about it, Chris, is like, look, if there isn't something that at least could be intrinsically completely intelligible, to use Lonergan's language, that could be this sort of self-explanatory fact in the most robust sense, then nothing is ultimately explained, right? All the stuff that isn't self-explanatory, if it doesn't ultimately get cashed out, and that which could be or is this robustly self-explanatory fact, then nothing's been explained. We've really just sort of maybe been under the illusion that we've been explaining things. But once we get to a sort of rock bottom absurdity, it's revealed as being an illusion, unless we get to that perfectly, completely, unrestrictedly intelligible act.
So I totally agree. I know there are those who disagree with this. I once had this discussion over social media with a number of people, where the idea was, if A explains if B explains C, but there's no explanation for B, have you really explained C? And I know some people think that at some level you have. I've seen people defend that view. Part of what's driving me to something like the doctrine of divine simplicity is that I agree with you that you haven't. If you've explained C by way of B, and B calls out for explanation as well, and you don't provide it, then you haven't ultimately explained C. Or we might say that you've explained C for some narrow purpose, right? If I'm an engineer and I want to know why the bridge stays up, obviously, I'm going to explain that in terms of the support cables and the structure of the towers in the bridge, and so on. And it's, some level before I start getting into the theoretical physics, I'm going to stop explaining. And for engineering purposes, we'll consider that I've given a full explanation. But I think when you're doing metaphysics, you need to at least have the potential of carrying that chain of explanation back to something which is in some sense self-explanatory, even if we can't grasp that explanation right now. Or else, you haven't metaphysically explained anything at all. Even if we might want to say that in some restricted sense for this or that purpose, you've explained it. You have not engaged in metaphysical explanation of a fact by offering some explanans, which itself calls out for explanation, unless it is indeed possible to carry that chain of explanation all the way back, at least in principle, to something which is self-explanatory, and which is therefore simple. I mean, I think that the connection between self-explanation and simplicity is a pretty tight one.
Right. Yeah. And that's sort of, to simplify it, you just sort of look at the world around us and you see these categories of things, these types of things that, given their nature, are not the sort of thing that could ever be self-explanatory. And for Aquinas, it ultimately comes down to compositeness, right? His theory of contingency is explained by his theory of compositeness. It's compositeness that makes sense of contingency, I think, for the Thomistic view, right? So it's just going to have to be the case that if anything could be self-explanatory, it couldn't be something of that sort, right? It's going to have to escape that category or those categories altogether. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Because the thing there being, right, like, even if the composition in question obtains necessarily, that does not mean it doesn't call out for explanation. Right.
Yeah. All right. So that's good. I've talked a lot about the motivations of divine simplicity before, so I'm happy with that, Chris. Let's go to modal collapse now. Where do you want to pick up
Right.
this conversation? We've had this conversation before. Like I said, it's evolving. We want to just kind of get the rudiments of one of the, I don't know, more recent objections out there. I'm going to let you lead this one, and then I'll interject whenever it makes sense to do so. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah. As I recall, I think we did a whole marathon episode back in the day, back during COVID times, I believe, on the initial analysis paper I wrote, and which was published in 2019.
Yeah.
That paper has gotten a lot of attention, has over 20 citations now, some of them friendly, some of them not so friendly, and 20 citations for the those of your listeners or viewers who are not familiar with how the philosophical literature works is pretty big. Yep. If you have viewers who are physicists or chemists, it doesn't sound like a big number because those kinds of papers routinely get hundreds or thousands of citations. Yeah. But it's a big number in philosophy, in part because the median number of citations for a paper in philosophy is 0.
Right.
Some of those citations have been friendly, people building on my work there. Some not so friendly, people attacking the argument or posing new arguments in light of my demonstration of the invalidity of the what we might call the simple argument. And so my primary project on this issue since the publication of the analysis paper has been a paper that is now going to appear in February of next year. So in just over a month's time.
Oh, good. We have a release date on that finally. Mm-hmm.
Yes, February 10th, 2023. Robert Kuhn's and Jonathan Fuqua's Classical Theism, New Essays on the Metaphysics of God. It will be published where my chapter is chapter 12, How an Absolutely Simple Creator Escapes a Modal Collapse, which takes us more or less to the cutting edge of my recent thought about the issue. Because almost as soon as I got the analysis paper out there, it occurred to me that, like, okay, yes, the simple argument is plainly invalid, but there is this much deeper worry, and from that worry, I thought up a much better way of putting the argument in a clearly valid form that I think better represents that worry than the simple argument. And I'll get into detail about this in just a moment. And then, so what I'm doing in this paper is I rehearse a little bit about the simple argument and why it's invalid. I set up the intuition behind the new argument, and then I spell out the new argument. And then I do two things with that new argument. One is I show that, just as with the simple argument, if indeed you think this argument is sound, then it's going to cut the legs out from so-called neoclassical theism, as much as, and from every Abrahamic religion, I think. Mm-hmm. As much as from under the classical theists, that we're all in the same boat as far as this argument goes, right? Because the problem is ultimately one about how contingency is derived from the necessary, not a problem about how a simple God creates. Mm-hmm. And because the straightforward answer to how a simple God creates is that in the same way that a non-simple God creates. There's no actual mystery about that. The problem is about how you get contingency from necessary things. Mm-hmm. And then I very briefly, somewhat hand-wavingly, point at what I think is the proper solution to that problem in a way that preserves God's control over what he creates, right? Without having a worry about indeterminism in the divine creative act. Good. So, right. So just to go into a little bit more detail on each of those, I start off with a section, first of all, an introduction where that was inspired a little bit by William Lane Craig, actually, because William Lane Craig did a discussion. I forget on whose channel this appeared. I believe it was on Cameron Bertuzzi's Capturing Christianity. He did a dialogue with Ryan Mullins on divine simplicity, I believe, where he, I believe, accused the doctrine of not having a very strong actual heritage in the ancient apostolic Christian period, that it was an import from Greek philosophy, which is a common charge against the doctrine. And so I actually cite some Saint Hilary of Poitiers, and even more to the point, Saint Irenaeus, where they articulate doctrines of divine simplicity that, you know, identify God with his attributes, which is, I think, at the, you know, that's the heart of the doctrine as far as objections to it from neoclassical theism go. When you look at what neoclassical theists are most commonly attacking, it's the identification of God with his attributes, right? They're much more rarely going after, you know, the identification of God's essence with his existence, or the identification of God's nature with the subject, and so forth. They seem most concerned, obviously, about the identification of God with his justice and his mercy and among other things, his knowledge, and among other things, his creative act. And so, you know, you have, for example, Saint Irenaeus saying that he is a, quote, simple, uncompounded being without diverse members, and altogether like and equal to himself, since he is wholly understanding and wholly spirit and wholly thought and wholly intelligence and wholly reason and wholly hearing and wholly seeing and wholly light, and the whole source of all that is good, even as the religious and pious are wont to speak concerning God. And of course, again, I assume many of your viewers and listeners are aware of this, but Saint Irenaeus is 2 generations removed from Saint John the Apostle. You don't really get any closer, more or less, you know, to the apostles than this. And one of the things you see Saint Irenaeus saying here, right, is that this identification of God with thought and intelligence and reason and light and the source of all that is good, that part is compatible with neoclassical theism. But you know, this identification of God with his attributes is according to Saint Irenaeus in his own day, how the religious and pious are wont to speak concerning God. So, right, I added those because I just thought it was an important thing to add about the actual Christian record on the doctrine. Obviously, that's not the full-blown Thomistic
paganism
doctrine.
Creeps in quick, doesn't it, Chris? So we're about to Christmas. We're about this pagan holiday Christmas here too. So
apparently, yeah, I mean, that's what you'd have to believe, is that I guess the Greek pagan philosophy, the corrupting influence of Aristotle got in there really fast, somehow right between Saint John the Apostle himself and Saint Polycarp, his disciple, and Saint Irenaeus, his disciple. You're 2 discipleships removed from Saint John the Apostle here, and you already see him not only endorsing what I think is the most controversial entailment of the doctrine of divine simplicity as it exists today, namely that God is identical with his attributes, but saying that this is how the religious and pious are wont to speak concerning God, that it was the common way of speaking at that time, about God, that he is identical with his attributes. So yeah, I mean, I just don't know how you square that with the common anti-doctrine of divine simplicity claim that its introduction into Christianity was the result of a corrupting Greek philosophical influence on the faith. It just wasn't, unless Saint Irenaeus is a corrupting Greek philosophical influence on Christianity. At any rate, okay. So then, moving on. The next thing I do in there is I rehearse what I call the simple argument. One, that necessarily God exists. Two, that God is identical to God's act of creation. And three, therefore, that necessarily God's act of creation exists. This is the argument that I attribute to Ryan Mullins, because Ryan Mullins very obviously endorses it in his book. He has subsequently tried to claim that he doesn't endorse it, that it's not his argument. I challenge anybody to go read the book for themselves. It is very obviously his argument. And if Ryan ever wants to actually discuss this in any venue with me, I'd be happy to have him do so.
I would be happy to host it. Indeed.
It is indeed his argument. You only need to read the analysis paper to see that it's his argument. He has, to his credit, developed other arguments since my paper came out, because I think at some level he knew that he needed to, that I had correctly characterized the argument, and I had demonstrated that it's invalid. And so I just bring the reader up to speed on why this is in fact invalid and insufficient as a matter of advancing the objection of modal collapse against the doctrine of divine simplicity. Crucially, with including my parody, which shows that it's not a problem for the doctrine of divine simplicity at all. If indeed it's sound, because if it were sound, if that were a valid mode of reasoning, then you could construct another argument, which I call the quote alternative argument from modal collapse, which goes: 1, necessarily God exists; 2, God is identical with the creator; and 3, therefore necessarily the creator exists. But of course, if it's necessarily the case that a creator exists, and a creator can't be a creator without a creation. Obviously, we get that necessarily
modal collapse, right? Yeah,
there is a creation, and you could make that argument more if you want a full-on modal collapse, right? Not just a necessary creation, but a necessary creation down to all the details of the actual world. You could just specify, right, more precisely in premise 2 that God is identical with the creator of. Christopher Tomaszewski, as speaking on the Philosophy for the People podcast at 7:47 p.m. Eastern Time on December 23rd, 2022, right? Just fill in whatever details you like there in premise 2 to get a full modal collapse, right? And that's what you'll get. And the problem, of course, there is, for those who would think that modal collapse is somehow a problem for divine simplicity, is that I didn't say anything about divine simplicity there, right? I just ran the same logical, I ran the same form of argument as appears in the original modal collapse argument, without any mention of divine simplicity, and using premises just that every Abrahamic religion endorses, namely that necessarily God exists and that he's identical with the creator. So huge problem for the simple argument. It's invalid, and if it weren't invalid, it would be a modal collapse objection against Abrahamic religion, not against classical theism. So
everybody should be happy that it's invalid, which it is, right?
Right. Everybody should be very happy that it's invalid. Yes. although, right, I mean, just to back up for a moment here, and I don't mean to single Ryan Mullins out for any kind of special treatment here, particularly, but I do this in part because he has replied in 2 different venues to the analysis paper. Kind of want to just, in some kind of popular venue, like a podcast, get it out there that both papers have very serious issues. So if I can share my screen here.
Yes,
Yes.
please. Let's
Share
do it.
screen
And by the way, I just want to remind everybody, Chris has gone into detail in that analysis paper, both on my podcast before and John DeRosa's. So we're trying to get up to speed on where the conversation is now. If that analysis paper is new to you, please go and read it. For one thing, it's a very good paper, very concise, but also check out our previous conversations as well. All right, so here we go, Chris. Let me know when you're ready. I think I should be able to pull it up. Here we go.
Yes, I'm ready.
Awesome.
Yep. Great. So for example, so one venue in which Ryan, one reason the reason I am picking on Ryan is because, like I said, he's attacked the paper in 2 different venues. And there's at least one serious problem that I'm going to discuss in each of those papers that I think illustrates that these are not very good replies. Like I said, I think I said this before we started the podcast, but I do intend to eventually reply in print where I can, perhaps in my book, perhaps in other venues, as the case may be, to this. But I do want to just get it out in a popular venue. Some of what has happened with the replies to the analysis paper.
Yeah, excellent.
So here's an excerpt from the analysis paper. This would be from page 280 of the paper, where I talk about the way in which God's act of creation, the phrase God's act of creation, the term God's act of creation, designates God. So I entertain a certain objection. I say, here, the opponent of the doctrine of divine simplicity may object that if God's act of creation designates God at all, it must do so in virtue of something intrinsic to God, for acts are intrinsic to their actors. And since God is necessarily how he is intrinsically, if it designates God in virtue of his intrinsic act, it must do so in every possible world and therefore designate God rigidly. And I reply that this isn't the case. While God's act is indeed intrinsic and therefore identical to him, God's act of creation designates that act not how it is in itself, but by way of its contingent effects. Mm-hmm. That is, whether God's act of creation designates God's act depends on the existence of a creation which is contingent, and so the designation is not rigid. And since the designation is not rigid, the identity statement is not necessary, as it must be in order to validate the argument for modal collapse. Mm-hmm. In his chapter contribution to the T&T Clark Handbook of Analytic Theology, Ryan characterized the claim that you see highlighted here, right, that God's act of creation designates that act not how it is in itself, but by way of its contingent effects, as that I had said that that God's intentional act designates or refers to God's effects instead of God himself. And he cites the page that I just read from. Except that I never said that God's intentional act or God's act of creation designates God's effects instead of God. I said it designates that act, which is God, not how it is in itself, but by way of its contingent effects. My claim was one about how the term designates God, not about whether it designates his effects instead of him. So that is, I mentioned this because that's really bad. I think from just a scholarship point of view, it's remarkably bad to get somebody's claim that wrong.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So, and then let's see if I can. Yeah. So here's a more recent paper. You can still see this, right? You can see this paper.
Yep, the persistent problem. This is the newer one.
Good. Yeah, this took a while to come out in the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion, but it finally is out and is primarily, again, a reply to my work. And this is co-authored by Ryan Mullins and Shannon Bird, where they try to construct a new argument. For those of you who are wondering about my more substantive reply to this argument, or the one that appears in Ryan's chapter in the T&C Clark Handbook of Analytic Theology, I did an episode, I think I've done multiple episodes on the Classical Theism podcast where I spell that out. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but I do want to just note one important, again, like really important error here about the way that they're replying to my argument. So here you see toward the bottom of page 33, they, after presenting their argument, they claim that before moving forward, they want to note two complaints from some contemporary proponents of DDS. First, some have said that there is an ambiguity in what phrases like God's act refer to. For example, this has led some to charge that all versions of the modal collapse argument are invalid because they wrongly assume that God's act rigidly designates God. So one thing just to say about that, first of all, I mean, insofar as they're talking about me here, which presumably, again, they're doing, and this came up in a little bit in John Waldrop's paper as well. This idea that somehow I'm saying that in the analysis paper I said that all versions of the modal collapse argument are invalid, or that they're generally invalid. I never made that claim. It's one way you can know that I never. One way you can know that I never made that claim is because it's an absolutely ridiculous claim. You can come up with
validity comes on the cheap, my friends, right? Yeah.
Extremely cheap. You can come up with a valid argument for literally any cockamamie conclusion you like. Right? Just give me your conclusion, whatever it is, right? P, and right. I mean, all I got to do is say, well, look. A implies P, and A, therefore P, right? I can give you a valid argument for literally any ridiculous conclusion you like. It's not hard to come up with a valid argument for anything, including modal collapse. It would be absurd to say that all versions of the modal collapse argument are invalid. Another reason why it would be plainly absurd to say that is, of course, that there are presumably infinitely many versions of the modal collapse argument, because there's infinitely many ways of constructing arguments for any conclusion. Some a lot simpler than others. And so I don't know where this idea has come from. John Waldrop's paper is a little bit more modest and attributes to me only the claim that that modal collapse arguments are generally invalid, but I don't make that claim either. The claim I make in the paper is that Mullins' argument is invalid, and that I think that the general structure or the central error that Mullins makes can be found in some other modal collapse arguments that I cite in the analysis paper. I don't know how you get from that claim to the claim that modal collapse arguments are generally invalid, or that they're all invalid, which is preposterous. Right. But more importantly, you get here right at the top of page 34, we reply that in the case of the simple God, the designation of God's acts in their premise 6 is rigid because God's intentional actions are identical to God's existence, as is explicitly endorsed by classical theists in premise M3. They're referencing the premises there. I mean, there are the premises for anybody who wants to take a look at them. I've stated elsewhere why I think this argument doesn't work either. I'm not going to get into that here. Those who are interested can go see the episode on the Classical Theism podcast that I did there on that. But I just want to talk about rigid designation for a moment here and how they've fundamentally misconstrued it. So just to back up for a second, give listeners and viewers some background. To say that a term rigidly designates an entity, this is a technical turn of phrase that comes to us from Kripke in the middle of 20th century philosophy, right? And what it means is that the term in question designates the same entity in every possible world where that entity exists. So a classic, the canonical case of a rigid designator is a name, a proper name.
Yeah, proper
right?
names.
So Christopher Tomaszewski designates me in every possible world where I exist. Obviously, that's not all possible worlds. It's presumably a narrow slice of all the possible worlds. But every world where I exist, the proper name Christopher Tomaszewski designates me. Contrast that, and so for that reason, we say it's a rigid designator, right? It's rigid in the sense of like it can only designate one thing, assuming that thing exists in the possible world under discussion. You can contrast that with, what we might call a flaccid designator, or more commonly a non-rigid designator, such as the president, right, of the United States, the president of the United States, where what that designates is whoever happens to hold that office right now. It does not designate the same thing in every possible world where that thing exists, right? So in this world, that term currently designates Joseph Biden. However, it doesn't designate Joseph Biden in every world where Joseph Biden exists, right? Because there's a very nearby possible world, a possible world which could have very easily been the actual world, where that term designates Donald Trump, or for that matter, Hillary Clinton. We could very easily be in Hillary Clinton's second term if things had gone differently in 2016. Right? And in those possible worlds, the president designates Trump or Clinton instead of designating Biden. All right. All the same, nobody should therefore deny that the president is identical to anybody other than, or anything other than, Joseph Biden, right? Like, who's the president identical to? Joseph Biden, right? So the mistake that Mullins and Bird make here is to claim that they've shown that God's act rigidly designates God because God's intentional actions are identical to God's existence. Well, no, that's not sufficient to show that it rigidly designates God or his actions, for the reason that I just gave, right? The president is identical to Joe Biden, but that doesn't mean that the term the president rigidly designates Joe Biden. And this is, I think, again, this is a kind of very elementary error in the sense that if Mullins and Bird actually knew what the term rigid designation meant, if they did their homework on Kripke properly before writing this, they would not have made this mistake. And so another reason I point this out, and I've said this before, and I want to continue saying this because I think this is important, and because I know that opponents of Thomas Aquinas continually mock us for saying this. I want to point out that this is a case where, where I, as a Thomist, am not accusing anyone of having not read enough Aquinas or not having understood Aquinas. What I'm accusing people of doing here is of not having read crypty.
Enough crypty, right?
Right? So don't let it be said, I suppose, that we Thomists are not ecumenical in our approach to philosophy. I'm a Thomist standing here telling the non-Thomists to please read more crypty. So no, Thomist objections to anti-Thomist work do not all reduce to the claim that you have not read enough Aquinas or that you have not understood Aquinas. Sometimes it boils down to you have not read crypty or you have not understood crypty. Okay. So let me stop sharing. There we go. Okay. So at least as far as Ryan Mullins' work replying to my paper goes, those are two examples, one from each of the papers that substantively interact with my analysis paper of places where I think he has grievously erred in trying to interact with the work there. However, enough about the analysis paper. So where I go next with the paper that's going to appear as a chapter in this volume coming out in February, is that I next appeal to what I think is a very important intuition in the debate about modal collapse, right? I say, look, is the doctrine of divine simplicity out of the modal collapse woods simply because this simple argument that I've discussed in the analysis paper, just because that version's invalid? No, not at all. I don't think so. Not just yet. So I say here, right, that the doctrine of divine simplicity is committed to something that I'll call the modal indiscernibility thesis, right? And this thesis is that if the doctrine of divine simplicity is true, then God in any given possible world is really intrinsically indiscernible from God in any other possible world, which is to say, right, like if you just look at how God is in himself intrinsically across all possible worlds, you won't be able to see any hint of difference in him, right? In any possible world, the only difference across the possible worlds is going to be in whether and what he creates, right? And so then you're left with this, right? I mean, the intuition here is basically, well, like, how can that be, right? How can God be absolutely the same across all possible worlds, but what he creates can be so varied across all possible worlds, right? That's what I'm pointing to here as, I think, the problematic intuition.
Yes, right. That's right.
I then go on to develop this into a more robust argument against the doctrine of divine simplicity, something I call the modal indiscernibility argument, where I argue, look, God is absolutely simple. If God is absolutely simple, then he is really intrinsically indiscernible across all possible worlds. If he's really intrinsically indiscernible across all possible worlds, then his act is really intrinsically indiscernible across all possible worlds. And if his act is really intrinsically indiscernible across all possible worlds, then the effects of this act do not really vary across all possible worlds. Yep. And therefore, the effects of God's act do not really vary across all possible worlds. And that conclusion there would just be a modal collapse, right? If we're going to say that the effects of God's act do not really vary across all possible worlds, that just is a modal collapse. And then the rest of the paper is concerned with, in one way or another, trying to deal with this argument. And the first thing I do is something that I did in the analysis paper as well, is to show that if this argument is indeed valid and sound, then it's going to be a problem not just for proponents of classical theism, for proponents of the doctrine of divine simplicity, but it's also going to be a problem for every Abrahamic religion. And let me, I guess, just for the sake of clarity and ease, I'll share my screen again here, where I have the argument up here, as people can read along as I go. So then I have a fourth section here, right? What's simplicity got to do with it anyway? Where I construct a parallel argument to the modal indiscernibility argument, what I call the essential modal indiscernibility argument. And it goes like this, right? God exists necessarily, right? If God exists necessarily, then God's essence is really intrinsically indiscernible across all possible worlds. If God's essence is really intrinsically indiscernible across all possible worlds, then the effects of God's essence do not really vary across all possible worlds. And if the effects of God's essence do not vary across all possible worlds, then God's non-essential attributes do not really vary across all possible worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And if God's non-essential attributes do not really vary across all possible worlds, then God's act is really intrinsically indiscernible across all possible worlds. And if that's the case, then the effects of that act do not really vary across all possible worlds. And then we're to the conclusion here, right? The same conclusion as in the modal indiscernibility argument. The effects of God's act do not really vary across all possible worlds. And there we have it. We have a modal collapse.
Yeah.
Of course, the difference here is, right, I've not appealed to anything that is unique to classical theism or to proponents to the doctrine of divine simplicity, right? All I've said is, all I've relied upon here, right, is that God exists necessarily. That's a very much at the heart of all Abrahamic religion, and even it goes beyond Abrahamic religion. The only person I could think of who would want to deny this is Swinburne, and even then, only in a certain kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then I talk about God's essence, which is also at the very least extremely common in natural theology across all the Abrahamic religions to speak of God's essence, and the way that God's essence is related to his non-essential attributes.
Yep.
And just using those two theoretical posits, right, God's necessity and his essence, I get to the same place, right, that there's a modal collapse, right? And so the central idea behind this argument, is basically, at the end of the day, right, like the proponent of modal collapse, at least the proponent of modal collapse using this more robust version of the argument I've crafted in this chapter, wants to say, look, if God is the same across all possible worlds, then the effects of God's act have to be the same across all possible worlds. And I say, okay, fine, let's say that's right. Here's another thing that even non-classical theists think is the same across all possible worlds: God's essence. It exists necessarily, and it's the same across all possible worlds. And you have to agree with that, right? Because it's a standard, almost axiomatic truth about essence, that something can't have a different essence on pain of not being the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if God exists in all possible worlds, he has to have the same essence in all those possible worlds. So God's essence exists necessarily, and it is the same across all possible worlds. God's essence is ultimately going to be, and you can fill in whatever kind of theory you want here. It doesn't really matter, right? The cause of his non-essential attributes, the foundation of his non-essential attributes,
the ground, right?
The ground of his non-essential attributes, however you want to put it. Nothing really ends up riding on it, right? The idea here being, at least nothing obviously rides on it. If someone wants to say that something rides on it, then the gauntlet is thrown down, and I invite them to make that case. But the idea here, right, is in some way or another, God's non-essential attributes have to flow from God's essence. But God's essence is the same across all possible worlds. So how, right, if we think, well, the classical theist is in trouble because God's the same across all possible worlds, and yet God's effects are different across all possible worlds, then the non-classical theist, the theistic personalist, whatever you want to call them, is in trouble because they postulate a divine essence, which is the same across all possible worlds, even though they want God's non-essential attributes to be different across all possible worlds, including, of course, presumably, right, his act of creation, right? Or maybe in some, obviously, they're going to want to say in some worlds he doesn't have that at all, because he doesn't create it. Not some worlds, in one world, exactly one. Or maybe not exactly one for the non-classical theists, because you think, God could vary in all kinds of different intrinsic ways without creating. And that would generate different possible worlds for the non-classical theists. And then in worlds where he does create, his act of creation is going to be a different kind of act. It's going to look different. But the problem is these acts of creation, or the absence thereof, right, all have to ultimately be, these acts of creation all have to be ultimately grounded in or caused by, flow from the divine essence. That divine essence is the same across all possible worlds. So those non-essential attributes have to be the same across all possible worlds, including the act of creation. And if the act of creation is the same across all possible worlds, then the effects of that act of creation have to be the same across all possible worlds. And there we are. Now the non-classical theist is in the exact same boat.
Same boat, right? Yeah.
As the classical theist, on pain of either having to say that God doesn't exist necessarily, or having to say that God doesn't have an essence at all. That would be a really big bullet to bite, I think. Or on pain of saying that somehow, and this is the key point, right? Like, draft whatever solution you want to how the non-classical theist gets out of this problem, right? It should be pretty evident that the classical theist is going to be able to just copy that solution over and say the same thing about how God is able to create different worlds despite being intrinsically the same across all possible worlds. Right. And I pose this very dilemma in a very succinct question to Ryan Mullins and William Lane Craig in the discussion they had on the Doctrine of Divine Simplicity on Capturing Christianity back when they had that. I think that was about a year ago now, or maybe a little more. And I think both William Lane Craig and Ryan Mullins appealed to said, well, you look, the way you get out of that issue is just that free will, which God has.
Thanks, says the classical theist. We'll take some of that.
Right. Not determined, right? He's not determined in how he acts given his freedom of will, right? And so just you can have a different kind of act of creation spring forth from the divine essence, given God's freedom of will, right? And and then I'm just going to say, look, I mean, you can have different created effects spring forth from the divine essence given God's free will. It's very easy for us to say that exact same thing, and there doesn't seem to be any clear there's no obvious reply, right? It's to our ability to copy that answer over.
No principled resource they could use to get out of it that the classical theist could not also use. That's right.
Right. Yeah. So, however, one thing I don't like about that, obviously, this appeal to pure kind of indeterminism, is that, of course, indeterminism in and of itself is not freedom of the will. Just because, we're not, just because God is not determined to act in a certain way doesn't mean that he's free and has the kind of control over his creation that you'd want him to have.
To draw this out, I mean, that's the classic objection against libertarian freedom, right? People will say, well, if it's not determined, if it's indeterministic, it's random.
It's this so-called luck objection to libertarian free will. That's right. So, of course, one thing to say, and I actually don't say this in this chapter, but I guess I should have. But one thing to say is, look, the classical theists can draw on, and this is a problem. I was aware of this problem for a while, but this problem was formalized by Joe Schmid in an article that I think came out in the International Journal for Philosophy of Philosophy of Religion. I think called From a Modal Collapse to a Providential Collapse. I forget the title, where he formalizes this worry. And one resource available to the classical theists is to just point at all the replies that have been made to the Locke objection to libertarian free will in the vast libertarian free will literature. I don't do that here. But another thing to do is...
Haldane has some great stuff on that, by the way, if anyone's interested. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the literature there is...
It's huge.
Enormous.
Yeah.
It's enormous. But one thing I do toward the end of the paper, and this is pretty fast and loose, in part because I was running up against a word limit here, and also because my thoughts on this are not complete. Before I get to that, I should also note another paper that's important here that people should read if they're interested in this is Elizabeth Anscombe's classic Causation and Determination, where she makes this point about determinism more broadly. Mm-hmm. That it's a mistake to think that causation is in itself per se deterministic,
right?
Yeah. But one way I deal with this in the paper, right, is I say that the classical theist, in fact, doesn't need to concede that the divine creative act is indeterministic, that God doesn't have control over what God creates. He's just somehow thinking, I'm going to try to create something, and something springs out, comes out the other end of the divine creative act, so to speak. And God is surprised or doesn't know or is not in control of what he's creating. Obviously, that would be problematic, deeply problematic, at least to Christianity, I would say also to Judaism and to Islam, again, across the whole Abrahamic board there. And I don't think the classical theist is ultimately going to need to make that concession. Of course, I should note that, at this point, right, I've shown that the classical theist and the non-classical theist are in the same boat. So whatever concession needs to be made in the end is going to be one that saves all Abrahamic theists, not just the classical theists. But I argue toward the end of the paper that you don't actually have to make that concession, and that you don't have to reject a deterministic causal relation between God's act of creation and the created effects thereof. And I argue that this is because centrally, right, God's act of creation is the action of an intelligent agent and is thus the fruit in part of his intellectual activity and divine wisdom. That is to say that the divine creative act is posterior to God's cognition of himself and is therefore, while really identical to God, virtually distinct from him, right? Mm-hmm. So distinct from him in idea, and not just distinct from him in idea, but distinct from him in idea in a way that actually cuts the conceptual space at its joints, so to speak. Right. Because mental causation, which is the kind of causation God is engaged in, I think, most fundamentally when he's creating, because mental causation is the kind of causation that God's fundamentally engaged in when he's creating, the report context here is hyper intentional, right? Which means that even necessarily co-referring terms can't be substituted in a way that preserves truth in the context of a sentence reporting an instance of mental causation and therefore an instance of divine creative activity. So consider a very simple example, right? Thinking that I saw Jack the Ripper caused me to run away, right? Now compare that with thinking that I saw Francis Tumblety caused me to run away. So Francis Tumblety was one of the suspects for Jack the Ripper for a while. I don't think anybody thinks it was actually him, but he was one of the suspects for a time. Now, suppose that, Jack the Ripper was Francis Tumblety. Well, then, even though both of these propositions report instances of mental causation, the first one, right, thinking that I saw Jack the Ripper caused me to run away, doesn't entail thinking that I saw Francis Tumblety caused me to run away, even though Jack the Ripper and Francis Tumblety would necessarily co-refer,
right.
If indeed Jack the Ripper was Francis Tumblety. Right, you can get situations where, one report about mental causation doesn't entail another report about mental causation, even though all that's been replaced are terms that necessarily co-refer. Now compare that to, right, what I call Z1 and Z2. Z1 is God's idea of zebras caused zebras to exist. And Z2, God's idea of unicorns caused zebras to exist. And I note here, right, that while Z1 is true, Z2 is obviously false, even though on classical theism, on the doctrine of divine simplicity, God's idea of zebras is necessarily really identical to God's idea of unicorns and to the divine essence, right? So the upshot of all this, right, is we can keep a deterministic causal relation between the divine creative act and the effects thereof, as well as a contrastive PSR, at least as far as this one question goes, if we bear in mind that the cause in question is virtually distinct from the divine essence, and that mental causation, which is the fundamental kind of causation God is engaged in when he's creating, is it creates a hyper-intentional propositional context.
Right.
So the idea here is that you don't even need indeterminism at the end of the day, because what is deterministically causing the creation that actually obtains is God's ideas of the things that he wants to create. And even though those ideas of the things he wants to create are really identical to all his other ideas of things that he doesn't want to create, it can still be the case that those ideas cause the things that actually exist to exist, and the ideas that they're necessarily identical to did not cause anything to exist, because mental causation and therefore the divine creative activity creates a hyper-intentional propositional context. So I'm not, there's a lot more that can be said about that. A lot more, hopefully, that I will say about that. And I think it's important, and it's a sketch of a solution to how you get the deterministic link back in a way that preserves the central Christian and other Abrahamic intuitions about the kind of control God has over creation. I think it's the right way to go. But I want to say, obviously, that's the part of the paper that I'm most unsure about and that I reserve for future revision and elaboration.
Yeah, well, it's always great to have you build your thoughts out here, Chris, and that's awesome. We pretty much got through the full paper, which is fantastic. And I believe this is at least maybe the initial draft is available on your academia page. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, it's up on my academia page for people who want to read the preprint. And the volume, again, is by Robert Koons and Jonathan Fuqua, Classical Theism, New Essays on the Metaphysics of God, to be published, as I understand it, by February 10th, 2023. And it's full of great essays by a number of fantastic scholars in classical theism. Alex Pruss has a chapter. Father James Dominic Rooney, who's recently been making a lot of waves in the debate about universalism. Has a chapter.
We kind of got it. Yeah, we had him on the podcast to talk about that. Yeah, that's right. And he's got
Right,
he's got an Essence Energies one in that volume, right?
That's right. Tim O'Connor is in there. Just lots of great people and great essays in there on various aspects of classical theism, including all the traditionally controversial doctrines. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I will link a whole bunch of stuff tomorrow. I have to jet. I have an at-home date with my wife, so I'll put the links in tomorrow where I'll link to Chris's other conversations on this, especially over classical theism, link to the paper itself and anything else Chris wants me to include. But before we go, Chris, anything else you want to announce? I know we did announcements up front, or how else can people best keep up with you? Give us all that good stuff. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's probably the best way to keep up with me is on Facebook. I have a website that I don't maintain properly. Yeah, people can always probably most easily contact me on Facebook. My website is firstphilosophy.net, which has preprints of some of my papers on there. My academia page is pretty up to date with preprints of my papers and stuff. And yeah, I'm going to be busy for the next year writing a book. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll have you back on once that book is, we'll have to do it before then because that book could be a while out. But so we'll want to pick your brain on your developing thoughts as it comes along. But in the meantime, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Please do support the channel by liking, sharing, subscribing, ringing that bell. We'll catch you guys